In 2015, it was confirmed that a sequel to The Conjuring would be released. The popular horror film, starring Vera Farmiga and Patrick Wilson, had become one of the greatest successes in recent years within the horror genre. The first movie was based on the case file of the Perron family, one of the most shocking paranormal cases ever documented in the history of supernatural investigations. But for the second installment, the story would focus on a case that might have even surpassed the Perron family's ordeal in terms of its impact, not only on those directly involved but also on the media. This was the infamous Enfield Poltergeist. It was the summer of 1977 in Enfield, a working-class neighborhood in the northern suburbs of London. On the night of August 30th, Margaret Hodgson, a divorced mother, put her 4 children to bed: Margaret, age 13, Janet, 11, Johnny, 10, and Billy, 7. The evening was calm, the weather mild, everything suggested a long and peaceful night ahead. But something was about to happen, something that would mark the beginning of a terrifying, unexplained series of events that continue to puzzle experts to this day. What began that night would not only change the lives of Margaret and her children, but also leave a deep mark on the entire Enfield neighborhood. That night, Margaret was suddenly awakened by the terrified screams of her children, Janet and Johnny. Alarmed, she rushed upstairs to their room. Everything seemed normal, but the children insisted that their beds had shaken violently, as if something invisible had grabbed hold of them. Margaret tried to calm them down, thinking it was nothing more than a bad dream, and eventually sent them back to sleep. But the following night, the same thing happened again. This time, the children told her they had heard loud knocks in the room, and then watched as a chair in the corner began to move on its own. At first, Margaret saw nothing unusual. To ease their fear, she carried the chair into her own bedroom. But when she turned off the light and began leaving the children's room, she herself heard the same heavy knocking sounds coming from the floor. Startled, she quickly switched the light back on. Everything appeared to be in order, the children were in their beds, the furniture in place. Yet as soon as she turned the light off again, the knocking returned, this time louder, accompanied by violent bangs. When she lit the room once more, she froze in shock. A heavy chest of drawers, which had been pressed against the wall, had moved several feet into the center of the room by itself. With great effort, she pushed the chest back to its place. But as soon as she turned her back, the piece of furniture slid forward again, as if dragged by unseen hands, this time in plain sight, with the lights on. Fear overwhelmed Margaret. Without hesitation, she grabbed her children and fled the room, running out into the street to seek help. A group of neighbors rushed over to help, checking both the house and the garden for any possible intruder who might have caused the noises Margaret described in horror. But they found nothing. While they were trying to reassure her, everyone suddenly heard it, sharp knocks echoing from inside the house, repeating in intervals. Alarmed, the neighbors immediately called the police. When the officers arrived at 284 Green Street, they too witnessed the unexplainable. Before their very eyes, a chair began sliding across the floor on its own, while the knocking sounds continued from nowhere. The police officer's official written statement about that night remains one of the very few documented cases in which law enforcement formally acknowledged paranormal activity. In the days that followed, the strange phenomena only grew worse. Furniture moved from place to place. Objects floated through the children's room as if guided by invisible hands. Word of the events spread quickly through the neighborhood, until finally, a team from the Daily Mirror newspaper arrived to investigate. The journalists and photographers who entered the house soon realized this was not a case of children's imagination or rumor. They themselves became witnesses to shocking events, things that could only be described as paranormal. One of the most infamous moments occurred when a Lego brick flew across the room and struck photographer Graham Morris in the forehead while he was preparing his camera in an empty bedroom. Reporter George Fallows, realizing the seriousness of the case, decided to connect Margaret with Maurice Grosse, a member of the Society for Psychical Research. After nearly a week of enduring constant disturbances and unexplained activity, on September 5, the Hodgsons welcomed Maurice Grosse into their home. At first, things grew strangely quiet. For 3 days, all paranormal activity ceased, as if the presence of an investigator had scared it away. But on the night of September 8, the chaos began again. It started with loud bangs coming from Janet's bedroom. Grosse, together with the journalists, ran upstairs. When they opened the door, they found Janet fast asleep in her bed, yet right beside her, a chair was hovering in midair, more than half a meter above the floor. In an instant, the chair dropped back down. For nearly an hour, nothing else happened. But then, as if to confirm their fears, the same phenomenon repeated itself. This time, the photographer, Graham Morris, managed to capture the levitation on camera. That wasn't all. The group also witnessed the closet doors swing open by themselves, and a toy shoot across the room, suspended in midair as though carried by invisible hands. Gross recalled feeling a sudden icy breeze that swept across the room. One thing became clear: the disturbances were strongest whenever Janet was nearby. It was then that theories began to emerge. Perhaps this was a case of a poltergeist, or even something far darker, demonic possession. Only 2 days later, the Enfield case made the front page of the Daily Mirror. Other London newspapers quickly picked up the story. That very same day, Maurice Grosse and Mrs. Hodgson even appeared on a television program to speak about what was happening in the house. The disturbances did not stop. In fact, they became more dangerous with time. Objects continued to vanish or reappear in different places. Reporters' recording equipment was frequently disrupted by strange electrical interference. Pools of water began appearing out of nowhere, soaking the floors without any visible source. Heavy furniture was hurled down the stairs from the second floor. Drawers were violently pulled out of dressers and flung across the room. Practically anything inside the house could suddenly take flight, posing real danger to anyone nearby. On several occasions, small bursts of fire would erupt from thin air, only to vanish seconds later without leaving behind any burn marks. Curtains billowed wildly as though caught in a storm, even though every window and door in the house was tightly shut. One of the most terrifying incidents came when Janet reported being yanked out of her bed by an unseen force and thrown toward the window. Before she could react, one of the curtains twisted into a spiral, wrapping tightly around her neck in an attempt to strangle her. Her mother, watching in horror, managed with superhuman effort to free her daughter from the grip of the fabric. But perhaps the most chilling phenomenon was the change in Janet's voice. She was only 11 years old, yet sometimes a deep, harsh, masculine voice would emerge from her throat. It claimed to belong to different entities and often spoke in vulgar, obscene language. Whenever this happened, Janet would fall into a trance-like state. One voice identified itself as Bill, a man who claimed he had died in the house. During these trances, Janet had to be restrained, as she would display unnatural strength for a child. She sometimes ran headfirst into walls, cursing in the rough voice of Bill. On one occasion, she even knocked a large social worker and ex-policeman off his feet with a single blow while he was trying to restrain her at her bedside. Maurice Grosse began conducting sessions to try and communicate with the supposed entities tormenting the family. They developed a crude system: 1 knock for yes, 3 knocks for no. During one of these sessions, the voice claiming to be Bill was asked how many years he had lived in the house. The reply came in the form of 53 distinct knocks. Doctors and psychiatrists also examined Janet, since she seemed to be the center of the activity. She underwent detailed medical tests, including laryngographs at the Maudsley Hospital in South London, to check for any abnormalities in her throat, vocal cords, or mental health. No evidence of fraud, illness, or physical abnormality was ever found. Interestingly, during this period of medical study, the poltergeist activity inside the house stopped completely. But not long after, it began again, though this time in a more sporadic and less violent way. Soon after, writer Guy Lyon Playfair joined Grosse in the investigation. The two men would spend the next 2 years carefully studying the case. Eventually, the disturbances faded, and the activity ceased altogether. Opinions about the Enfield case remain divided. Some experts insisted it could have been nothing more than a hoax orchestrated by Janet with the help of her siblings. Even Guy Lyon Playfair himself admitted that certain events might have been staged by the children. Yet, he also maintained that the majority of what he witnessed had no natural explanation and must have been genuinely paranormal. Years later, in 2011, Janet, by then 45 years old and living quietly in Essex with her husband, gave an interview to the Daily Mail. In it, she admitted to having fabricated about 2% of the events, but swore that the overwhelming majority were real. The involvement of Ed and Lorraine Warren in the Enfield case was, according to some, relatively minor. But the famous pair of paranormal investigators became some of the most outspoken defenders of its authenticity. Ed Warren claimed that he once personally saw Janet levitate. Lorraine has always maintained that the girl even vanished completely in front of her eyes, only to reappear 20 minutes later in the house's basement. Lorraine also stated that Ed had managed to communicate directly with the demonic entity inhabiting Janet. It is worth noting that Ed Warren was recognized by the Catholic Church as the only demonologist not belonging to the clergy. This infamous case became the inspiration for The Conjuring 2, The Enfield Poltergeist, released worldwide on October 23, 2015. What you are about to hear is the chilling recording of the so-called voice of Bill, speaking through Janet in front of numerous witnesses.